Well, good morning and welcome to the Well. If you haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Danny. I'm one of the pastors here and just excited and glad you're here in worship with us. And as Anne-Marie said, we are in this sermon series, Lost in Translation. We're talking about words that have been, through the course of history, lost in translation. Things that as we look back at the original meaning, the original intent of the authors, we're really trying to explore to say, like, well, what was the core of what they were trying to say? What was the core of the message they were trying to get across? And that doesn't mean that language doesn't evolve, and that doesn't mean that we can't learn things as words evolve and language evolves. That's not exactly what we're saying. But oftentimes we can look into scripture and we can find these words static on a page and we say, well, this is what it says, and we put it into our 21st century context and our 21st century brain and forget that it was written in a ancient or first century context. And so it's helpful for us to think through that. And so through the course of the series, we've tried to look at words that are maybe misinterpreted. Next week, we're going to be doing that for certain. But also, as we've been looking at this, look at how the evolution of certain words actually impacts how we understand its value in our life. And so today we're going to be looking at a word that maybe you have no beef with, you've not had any bad experience with, but one that I think our understanding of it will interplay with how we engage our own personal faith and our relationship with neighbors in their faith as well. And the word is righteousness. And maybe as you look at that word on its nose, you're like, again, no problems with this. This has only been up and to the right for me. It's been an amazing word, very valuable in my life. But maybe for you, you look at it and you're like, I've had some bad experiences. Maybe you hear it and you're like, I actually don't even know what it means. Like for me, growing up in church, I would often hear words thrown around and I would just smile and nod. And be like, for sure, I'm with you guys. I get what we're talking about here. And I had no idea what we were talking about, right? I was just trying to pretend like I got this whole idea of faking it till you make it. And I want us to not have to do that. Authenticity and vulnerability, honesty as we wrestle with things, understanding the context of where they've been and the context of where we're going, I think is important. Not even pretending like we have it all together, but really coming together to wrestle with what we have. And so if I was going to give you kind of our idea of where we're going, maybe our sermon in a sentence, it would be this, that righteousness is not about personal moral perfection, but it is about a level of communal faithfulness. And you may hear that and you're like, this is where I was, and you might land on that and be like, this is what I already thought. Maybe you're on the other side, and I'm going to give you a reason and a case for why I think we might, some of us, land on this idea of it being moral perfection or being this idea of a personal driven thing. And I want to challenge us and contend that it's far more about our impact and our connection to our neighbor and into society, and has to do with a communal level of faithfulness, not just about this internal moral perfection. And so if you want to get a little nerdy with me for a second, we're going to stick with the word righteousness. We're going to journey through its etymology, so the evolution of this word. Because when we look into our scripture, say you're reading out of the Common English Bible, like my Bible here is a Common English Bible. It's one of the translations, but you might have an NIV or an NRSV or an ESV or an RSV or a KJV. There's millions of translations, somehow always ending in V for version. But there are lots of different translations, but the Bible wasn't written in English, right? And so it was translated or transliterated from different things. That's why one of the reasons we've done some of these exercises, if you've been here for the first or second week, is trying to talk about the practice of translation, because it's not necessarily a one-for-one. And so when we read righteousness, especially in the Old Testament, it goes back to a Hebrew word, tzedakah. So I'm going to butcher some of these. I'm going to try my best to get them. But this Hebrew word tzedakah is this idea of justice, right relationship, and generosity. We see this used specifically in Isaiah 1:17. It says, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead to the widow's cause. That whole idea and what is being said here in Isaiah is where we get this biblical concept of righteousness, and among other places. And if we look into the Hebrew scriptures, there's hard places the book of Leviticus that has 613 or 15 laws in there, these Levitical laws, some about dietary restrictions, some about relationships, some about sacrificial things. Sometimes we look at those and we're like, those are archaic and out to date, and they don't hit our context anymore. I would generally agree with that. But again, not using a 21st century brain, getting ourselves in an ancient context, those laws were actually, even if they don't seem like it to us today in our modern concept, meant to elevate and protect the community. There were things around them that were swirling and things around them that were happening. And so what are some laws that we can have to uplift the widows and the people on the margins, to help people that are being oppressed. And we look at some of the Levitical laws, they're not like the greatest to women, for example, by modern standards, but also by like biblical standards in a patriarchal, male-driven society. Like a lot of the laws that were driven were ones that were meant to elevate women. And when we look at that, like across the board, when we see this kind of biblical concept and this Hebrew concept of righteousness, it was far more around community justice. Like that was what they were really striving for. But as we see the evolution of the word, the New Testament was written in Greek, and first century Christians, as they're writing some of these things down, Jesus, when he's talking, he's like speaking Hebrew. That's important to know as well. Like it wasn't like Jesus was speaking Greek, and that's why the New Testament was written in Greek. He was speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, right? And then it was written down by people that spoke Greek. So it was written down. But as it was translated from his words in Hebrew to Greek, the concept and the culture of kind of the Greco-Roman world was around ethics and law. Right? And so this ethical development of yourself, there were lots of gods oftentimes around that had to do with your personal ethic and the way you engage with your neighbor. And so as righteousness developed, and it was kind of written down in the New Testament in Greek, it had this ethical and kind of this law bent to it. It didn't necessarily get rid of communal justice, but it shifted this way. And then we see in the early first century church, it shifts to this idea of moral perfection. This idea of this me having to be like the most moral person. It's a little bit of like a hearkening back to the Levitical laws. They're like, we want to be righteous and we want to be blameless and we want to have all these things that we've done. And it hit this idea of moral perfection. And then transitions from there to personal salvation. And these two, moral perfection and personal salvation, important for like timeline to know. This is happening during like the times of like Martin Luther and the Reformation. They're seeing lots of things rising. Lots more people are becoming interested in the gospel story. Lots of people are coming interested in the church. There's some corruption in the church happening. And that's one of the reasons, like, well, if we're seeing corruption in the church and corruption in the world, this moral perfection is what it actually looks like to be righteous. And we're seeing the institutions fail, like the church. So Martin Luther, he's a Lutheran. He's pitching the idea that the Catholic Church is failing. And so as systems fail, there's this personal sort of moral perfection and salvation that's put on us. And the last one is kind of individual morality. I would say that's where we've kind of landed on righteousness now. Like when I think we talk about righteousness, we generally are talking about this individual level of morality. Like, am I making the right choices? Am I doing good by people? Am I loving my neighbor? Am I hurting people, lifting people? I think that's generally what we mean. I think all of these, in some level of their practice, are helpful. Other than maybe moral perfection, I would say if your goal is perfection, you're going to be continually like frustrated because you're not going to live in there. But I do think striving for like God's desire for us is what the heart of this was. And when we look at all of these things, this kind of evolution of the word, my hope for us is to look and see like what has been happening through human history that's led us to understand this. But I challenge for us today is how do we get back to understanding kind of the bookends of this? Both individual morality, so how we engage in ourselves, but how do we not divorce that from what the original Hebrew culture, the words of Jesus, the words of others would have thought, which was this communal level of justice together. Individual morality intersects with communal justice, and that's kind of where I want us to spend our time wrestling today. So with that in mind, if you would, I'd invite you just to maybe with one person, you can do a couple around, you turn, and when you think about righteousness, what pops into your mind? When you think about righteousness, what comes to your mind in terms of its implications on you, whether it's morally, theologically, whatever? Take a couple seconds, 60 probably, chat. Righteousness, what comes into your mind? I don't often do this because sometimes it can go off the rails, but I'm going to try it. Does anyone have anything they'd want to share? Anything that came up in conversation worth like throwing out? Any ideas of righteousness? Yeah, so self-righteousness, this idea of like, again, this individual side, but that's like more of a negative. Like if you talk about someone being self-righteous, yeah, the opposite of humble, right? This idea of being maybe prideful and self-righteousness kind of like actually go hand in hand, which is interesting, right? It becomes so much about ourselves that it's only about us. Kind of interesting way to think about it. Anything else? Righteous. Yeah. Yeah, I think about Finding Nemo, like the turtle. That's what immediately comes to my mind every time. Which I don't know if I can work that into a theological point, but I do find that to be true. Yeah, I mean, I think so for all of us, I think it's interesting, right? Like this idea of righteousness really does impact how we engage our neighbor, right? If it's only about us, then it doesn't really matter what's happening to our neighbor. And a great example of this is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. I've hit on this several times in the last month, but in short, the story like paints two people that go into the temple. One of them is like, thank God I'm not like this sinner. And the other one is like, God have mercy on me. God says one of them leaves justified or righteous. And that's the one that is interested in like finding their way to be more integrated into the community in a loving rubric in a way that not just elevates themselves, but helps them connect with the other people. The person on paper that was the most religious, the most educated, the most generous, did all the shared practice of the church, Jesus said left less righteous than the other person. And so that tells us it has to be far less connected, not connected, but far less connected to our individual actions that impact only ourselves and has some level of connection to the community around us. So that's the challenge I want to put before you, is that righteousness has some level of connection, if not a massive connection, to the community around us. And I was going to give you a couple of scriptures from the Gospels, but the first one comes from 2 Peter 3, verse 13. It says, and in this, Peter's talking about this idea that that the world is going to be made new, and like what's going to happen as this new creation comes together. It says there's going to be a new earth where righteousness is at home. It talks about where righteousness dwells. And oftentimes I think when we think about this idea of like heaven, and this is a little bit of what is talking about here in 2 Peter, it's like this place that we evacuate to, that we go to, that is all right. And what the author is saying here is that it's not necessarily a place even about us, but it's about what gets to dwell there, which is righteousness. This communal good and this communal justice, this individual level of connection to God and to neighbor, but there is this communal thing that is living and dwelling there in this restored world that not only we're at home, but God's righteousness is at home as well. And I think that's something important to think about, right? When we think about God making all things new and all things whole, I think sometimes and oftentimes we think about its implication just on us. And the author here is challenging us to think about, what does it just have to do not only with ourselves, but with our neighbor and the friends and the people that are around us, even our strangers, right, that are around us. But then Jesus, I think, does give a beautiful picture of what this looks like, both in Matthew and in Luke. He says that what are we challenged to do in this world where righteousness dwells? And there's a little bit of reverse engineering here, like it is what's talking about in 1st, 2nd Peter, like what does it look like for us to dwell there? Well, Jesus gives us the point. It looks like feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, caring for the least of these. And I love that those are all action-oriented things. There's feeding, welcoming, and caring for, right? Like finding these places where it's not just about myself, but the people that Jesus in this opportunity would talk about, the least of these, those on the margins, those that are outcasted, those that don't already have a seat at the table. It's feeding, welcoming, and caring for those people. And goes on in Luke chapter 4, verse 18 to talk about how, very similar, that he came to bring good news to the poor and liberate the captives, right? Bringing and liberating good news and for the people that are held captive, right? And this idea that I would challenge us to put before us is when we think about righteousness and what it looks like, whether we use the language or not. Like, I think sometimes righteousness is the goalpost through which we view our faith, whether we use that language or not. Because what we mean by that is right relationship with God, I think. And that's really another kind of hallmark of the original meaning, right? It was like how we kind of orient ourselves and line up with God, this right relationship. So if those are our goalposts, I think Jesus gives us an idea of what it looks like to move that direction, which again is feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, caring for the least of these, bring good news to the poor, and liberty or release to the captives. And so if I was giving you this idea of what righteousness isn't and what righteousness is, kind of going back to our sermon in a sentence, I would say this, that righteousness is not, how can I become a better person? Not how can I become a better person, but it is, how can I help the world become a more just place? How can I help the world become a place where everyone finds their seat? And there is some level, like justice means that I feel like I belong. Like that's something that I think is important, right? Like it is having something to do with me. And we can go back to our mantra, right? Your seat at the table can't cost someone else theirs. And what do we mean by that? Well, that also underneath that means you have a seat at the table, right? There's some level of connection to you, but it doesn't stop with you. And my challenge would be when we think about righteousness, it doesn't end with how can I become a better person, but it does end with how can I help the world become a place that looks more like what Jesus talks about in these passages of feeding the hungry? How can I be a person that helps the world be more just by welcoming the stranger? How can I help the world be more loving and just by caring for the least of these, proclaiming good news to the poor and liberty to the captives? Like, what does it look like to embrace this Hebrew version of community and communal justice, that it doesn't stop and end with me, but it's about the people that are on the margins and the outsides? And I think that was the vision that we see preached about in this passage in 1 Peter, talking about a place where righteousness dwells, a place where not just people dwell, not just we dwell, but a place where the goodness of God dwells, the justice of God dwells, the inclusion of God dwells, and a place where we have no opportunity and no desire to question our seat and our ability to be there, but also we don't question the opportunity and the seat that other people have there. And that's what I think righteousness encourages and compels us to do. When it stops and ends with us, then it's only about what I am doing, how much I've read, like the Pharisee in the temple, right? How many times have I tithed, and how many times have I read the Bible this week, and how many times have I fasted, and how many times have I gone to the temple? It's this pursuit of kind of myself. But like the other person in the temple, and like Jesus kind of implores us to do, what happens when we move our righteousness outside of ourselves to figure out how it engages and invites others in to experience the goodness of God that we've experienced for ourselves? That other people might experience the same sorts of love, grace, justice, and inclusion that we experience through the person and the power of Jesus. And so my hope and my challenge would be that as we're a church that wrestles with this, and like we've talked about different words and different things that have been translated, and this is perhaps the most amorphous in the sense that we don't use the word righteousness very often. But I would challenge you to think about it, righteousness as something that is a communal imperative of what it means to follow Jesus. That it was never just about us. It was never just about our own ethic, our own morals, or our own life and lived experience. But it was about how the goodness of the story of Jesus impacts our life so much that we want to help other people understand that goodness is offered to them the same as it was offered to us. And so my challenge would be through the songs we continue to sing, the way we share communion, the conversation we have, that would continue to point us to that truth and to that hope and to that knowledge today. So with that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I do just ask that as we continue to sing, as we prepare our hearts for communion, as we worship through the conversations we have, that you would help point us to a more interconnected world where we are not the Lone Ranger going at it alone, but we are interconnected to you and to one another, to the people we call friends and to the people that we know as strangers, that we are connected to each and every one of them in the same way we're connected to you. And so help us reclaim an understanding of righteousness that draws us closer to you and to those around us, makes this world look more like the kingdom of heaven and less like brokenness and division. Help us collaborate with you in the work of putting the pieces of this world back together so that it might be a place where your righteousness and your goodness dwells. Be with us now as we continue to worship. Pray us all in Jesus' name. Amen.